Louis Dulac's trauma is a foundational aspect of his character in The Vampire Chronicles, influencing his worldview and emotional journey throughout Anne Rice's series. His experiences of loss, grief, and the moral complexities of being a vampire deeply affect his perception of life, his relationships, and his actions. The way in which his trauma shapes his outlook on life can be analyzed through several key stages and themes in his character development. Before Louis is turned into a vampire, he is already burdened by significant trauma. He is a wealthy French brothel owner in Louisiana who suffers the sudden and painful loss of his family due to his younger brother Paul's suicide and his perceived rejection and subsequent alienation from his family for being a queer black man in the early 1900s. This loss devastates Louis, leading him to question the meaning of life and his purpose. His grief is intense and all consuming, and it marks the beginning of his emotional turmoil. This profound sense of loss and hopelessness leads Louis to contemplate death and escape from his unbearable sorrow. Louis's trauma during this period is a catalyst for his vulnerability to its offer of immortality. He is consumed by his grief, feeling disconnected from human life and unsure of how to move forward. His desperation for some form of relief from pain, coupled with his existential crisis, makes him an ideal candidate for Lestat's vampire gift, which he believes might provide him with an escape from the suffering of human existence. However, instead of finding solace, Louis finds that the trauma of his past is amplified by his transformation into a vampire. When Lestat turns Louis into a vampire, his trauma is exasperated rather than alleviated. Now immortal, Louis experiences an intense sense of alienation and guilt. While Lestat relishes his new life as a vampire, embracing its pleasure and power, Louis is horrified by the violent nature of his transformation. The act of killing to feed on human blood becomes a source of immense emotional conflict. His moral compass, shaped by his human life and the trauma of losing his loved ones, cannot accept the vampire's need to kill, and this creates a cycle of guilt and self-loathing that dominates his existence. The trauma of being responsible for the deaths of innocent people, even if it is necessary for his survival, burdens Louis deeply. He is unable to reconcile his desire to retain some sense of humanity with the harsh reality of vampirism, which requires him to take lives. His ongoing feelings of guilt reflect the inner turmoil of someone who is profoundly changed by trauma and yet unable to escape its grasp. He is not only traumatized by his own actions, but also by the fact that he is condemned to an eternity of violence, alienation, and a loss of the human connections he once cherished. Louis's trauma leads him to reject Lestat's hedonistic and nihilistic worldview, which embraces immortality as a liberation from human suffering. While Lestat sees vampirism as an escape from the constraints and pain of mortal life, Louis views it as a curse. He perceives immortality as an unending cycle of loss and sorrow, where time erodes everything, including the human qualities he once valued, like love and empathy. His trauma prevents him from seeing the vampire's existence as a gift or an opportunity to transcend human limitations. Instead, he believes that being a vampire is a form of eternal punishment, a punishment for the guilt he feels from his past life and for the murders he continues to commit. This conflict between Louis's emotional pain and Lestat's carefree attitude towards vampirism is a central theme in their relationship. Louis, haunted by the trauma of his family and burdened by his moral doubts, cannot reconcile the idea of living without a sense of redemption. Lestat's dismissal of these moral quandaries further isolates Louis, leaving him to navigate the complexities of his existence on his own. His trauma deepens his alienation from others, including Lestat, who represents the antithesis of Louis's emotional struggle. Throughout the series, Louis's trauma propels him into a search for redemption and meaning in his existence. He rejects the idea that immortality is something to be embraced without question, and instead seeks ways to mitigate his guilt and find some form of peace. His deep sorrow, combined with his understanding of the fleeting nature of human life, from his own traumatic experiences of loss, leads him to believe that there must be more to existence than endless suffering. This search for redemption is one of the defining aspects of Louis's character, driving his actions in the narrative. One of the most significant relationships in Louis's life is his connection with Claudia, the child vampire. Louis takes on a fatherly role for Claudia, and in some ways, caring for her becomes a means of dealing with his own trauma. He sees in her a reflection of his own humanity, and he is determined to protect her from the same despair and isolation that haunts him. However, his inability to prevent Claudia's eventual descent into madness and her ultimate death is another devastating blow to his already fragile emotional state. This loss reaffirms his belief that redemption is unattainable and that the trauma of immortality is unshakable. As Louis continues to live through centuries of vampirism, his trauma leads him to adapt a more emotionally detached and cynical outlook on life. He grows increasingly disillusioned with the possibility of redemption, and his past trauma keeps him from forming lasting, meaningful connections with others. He often seems to retreat into himself, finding solace in isolation and intellectual reflection rather than in human relationships. His trauma, in effect, makes him emotionally numb. This detachment is more apparent in his relationship with the vampire Armand, who offers Louis an alternative philosophy of vampirism, one that focuses on the liberation from human emotions and attachments. Louis' trauma makes him resistant to Armand's perspective, but it also prevents him from fully embracing the hope of reconciling with his own emotional turmoil. The cyclical nature of his trauma leads to a resignation that nothing, not even the possibility of finding peace with the vampire community, will ever heal the wounds of his past. Throughout the series, particularly in later novels like The Queen of the Damned and The Tale of the Body Thief, Louis remains a character deeply marked by the trauma of his past. He often reflects on his life with a sense of regret and sorrow, lamenting the fact that he was unable to protect his loved ones from death and that his existence has become defined by loss and moral struggle. His trauma leads him to become a more philosophical and reflective character, but also one who remains fundamentally unable to move beyond the suffering that defines his existence. His trauma, in many ways, becomes a lens through which he views not just his vampire condition, but all of existence. It shapes his sense of futility and his belief that life is inherently tragic, no matter the form it takes, human or vampire. Louis' trauma is integral to understanding his character throughout the Vampire Chronicles. From the devastating loss of his family to the moral and existential struggles that arise from being a vampire, Louis' trauma profoundly influences his outlook on life. His inability to reconcile his past with his vampiric nature leads him to a life of emotional isolation, guilt, and self-reflection. Ultimately, his trauma shapes not only his relationships, but also his search for meaning and redemption in a life that seems devoid of both. This makes Louis one of the most complex and tragic figures in Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles.